She wore her worst dress to meet her father's guest, until she discovered it was the Duke she loved. Lady Aurelia Beaumont had declared war on herself approximately 17 days after her 22nd birthday, following her third catastrophic London season and a particularly soul-crushing conversation with the Dowager Duchess of Pemberton about the proper way for unmarried ladies to hold their fans. The terms of surrender she negotiated with her own heart were brutal but simple. She would never marry unless it was for genuine intellectual connection, and she would absolutely never under any circumstances pretend to be less intelligent to attract a husband. This was a position so radical in 1840s England that it might as well have been treason. A woman's mind was considered roughly as attractive as a festering wound, something polite society pretended didn't exist. Smash that subscribe button like it's a crime scene. You don't want to miss what's coming next. The devastating consequence of this private rebellion was that Aurelia had spent the better part of 3 years watching every eligible gentleman in London flock toward young ladies who giggled like wind-up toys, never expressed a single original thought, and possessed the intellectual depth of champagne flutes. It was soul-destroying. More soul-destroying still was maintaining her composure whilst watching Tristan Blackwood, Duke of Ashworth, dance with those same empty-headed beauties season after season. Tristan Blackwood. Even thinking his name made Aurelia's treacherous heart perform gymnastics that would make acrobats weep with envy. She'd fallen desperately, hopelessly, magnificently in love with him during her first season at the Covington Ball, where he'd actually conversed with her for nearly 15 minutes about a philosophy text they'd both read. 15 glorious minutes during which he'd looked at her, truly looked at her, and debated Rousseau's social contract theory with genuine passion, not the condescending tone most men adopted when forced to discuss ideas with women. Then Lady Rosalind Pembroke had appeared in a gown that probably cost more than a merchant ship, and Tristan had excused himself with devastating politeness. Aurelia had watched him dance with Rosalind, then with the ethereal Miss Charlotte Westbrook, then with the reigning diamond of the season, Lady Genevieve Sterling. She'd understood the message with painful clarity. A duke didn't notice ordinary girls who read philosophy treatises and had dangerously subversive opinions about women's education. That had been 3 years ago. 3 years of watching Tristan from across crowded ballrooms. 3 years of seeing him surrounded by the most exquisite women in England. 3 years of carefully maintaining her dignity whilst her foolish heart insisted on hoping. And now, this Wednesday morning in late March, her father had announced yet another tedious visitor to their Mayfair townhouse. A most important guest, Aurelia, Lord Beaumont had said over breakfast, his tone suggesting this was somehow different from the endless parade of political allies and business associates who'd been tramping through their drawing room for as long as she could remember. Do ensure you look presentable. Aurelia had looked at her father, really looked at him, and made a decision that was either brilliantly defiant or catastrophically suicidal, possibly both. She was finished. Finished with restricting dresses that crushed her ribs until breathing became an exercise in endurance. Finished with having her hair tortured into elaborate architectural marvels that gave her migraines. Finished with smiling politely at her father's associates, whilst they pontificated about topics they assumed her female brain couldn't possibly comprehend. If she had to endure another afternoon of aristocratic tedium, she would at least be comfortable whilst doing it. Which is how, 2 hours later, Aurelia found herself standing in her bedchamber, staring at her reflection with a volatile mixture of satisfaction and absolute horror. The dress she'd chosen was a catastrophe. A brownish-gray abomination that had been banished to the darkest corner of her wardrobe 3 years ago, after her mother had declared it suitable for nothing except perhaps lining a horse's stall. It hung on her slender frame like a potato sack that had lost the will to live. The color made her look vaguely consumptive. Absolutely perfect. Her hair she'd attempted to arrange herself, dismissing her ladies-maid Bridget with the excuse of a severe headache. The result was, well, it was half-pinned and half-cascading down her back in chaotic waves, creating an effect that could generously be described as recently survived a windstorm, or less generously as hasn't encountered a brush in a fortnight. She'd omitted jewelry entirely. No gloves, no shawl, no ribbon. Nothing that suggested she'd invested even a moment's thought into her appearance. Bridget had actually gasped when she'd seen her. "Miss Aurelia, you cannot possibly. Lady Beaumont will." "Lady Beaumont will survive," Aurelia had said firmly, sweeping past her toward the grand staircase. "I'm appropriately covered, am I not? Nothing scandalous. Just thoroughly forgettable." That had been the objective. Forgettable. Unremarkable. So monumentally unimpressive that whatever tiresome guest was visiting would barely register her existence, allowing her to escape to the library within minutes. It was a brilliant plan. A foolproof plan. The plan survived approximately 5 seconds after she entered the drawing room. Because there, standing beside her father near the tall windows overlooking the garden, dressed in an impeccably tailored charcoal coat that fit his broad shoulders in a way that should absolutely be illegal, was Tristan Blackwood, Duke of Ashworth, the man she'd loved in secret for 3 agonizing years, the man who absolutely, positively should not be seeing her looking like this. Aurelia stopped so abruptly, she nearly stumbled over her own wretched dress. Her hand shot out to grip the doorframe for support, her knuckles whitening. Every instinct screamed at her to flee. She took 1 step backward, then another. Her mother's hand clamped around her elbow like a velvet-covered vice. "Aurelia," Lady Beaumont said, her voice honey-sweet and utterly terrifying. "Do come greet our guest." Aurelia's father, the Marquis of Beaumont, looked up from whatever document he and the Duke had been examining. His expression cycled through several emotions in rapid succession: surprise, confusion, and what might have been suppressed laughter desperately masquerading as a cough. "Ah, Aurelia," her father said, his voice carefully neutral. "May I present His Grace, the Duke of Ashworth. Your Grace, my daughter, Lady Aurelia Beaumont." This was hell. This was actual, literal, theological hell. Tristan turned toward her, and Aurelia watched his expression with the fatalistic calm of someone watching their own public execution. She braced herself for the polite indifference, the barely concealed disappointment, perhaps even a flicker of pity for the Marquis's unfortunate daughter, who apparently dressed herself in complete darkness. What she saw instead made her heart stop entirely. Tristan Blackwood was staring at her with undisguised, burning fascination. His dark eyes, she'd forgotten how dark they were, like expensive cognac in midnight, traveled over her disastrous appearance, not with disgust or mockery, but with something that looked dangerously like wonder. One corner of his mouth curved upward in a smile that transformed his usually serious, intimidating expression into something warm and genuine and absolutely devastating to her composure. "Lady Aurelia," he said, his deep voice carrying a note of warmth that sent shivers cascading down her spine despite the fire crackling in the hearth. He stepped forward and bowed, a proper deep bow, not the perfunctory nod most men gave to unmarried ladies they considered beneath their attention. What an unexpected pleasure. Unexpected? That was certainly one word for it. Disastrous seemed more accurate. Catastrophic. Apocalyptic. Aurelia's mind raced through her limited options. She could faint, no, too theatrical. Claim sudden illness, no, too obvious. Simply turn and run, no, her mother still had her arm in a death grip that would require medical intervention to break. She was trapped. Utterly, completely, spectacularly trapped in her worst dress before the man she loved more than reason itself. Very well then. If fate had decided to humiliate her before Tristan Blackwood, she might as well face it with whatever shreds of dignity she could salvage from this wreckage. Aurelia straightened her shoulders and dropped into a curtsy that was technically correct, even if her horrendous dress bunched awkwardly around her knees like a dying sea creature. "Your Grace. My father neglected to mention we'd be entertaining a duke today. Had I known, I might have dressed for the occasion." The words emerged more tartly than she'd intended, edged with defensive sarcasm. Heat flooded her cheeks. Wonderful. Now she was being rude to a duke in addition to looking like an escaped scarecrow. But Tristan's smile only widened, transforming into something that looked almost delighted. On the contrary, Lady Aurelia, he said, his dark eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made breathing difficult. I find your attire a refreshing truth. A refreshing truth? What an peculiar choice of words. How remarkably diplomatic of you, Your Grace, Aurelia heard herself say, though her voice sounded distant to her own ears. Though I suspect your definition of refreshing truth is extraordinarily generous. Her mother's fingers tightened warningly on her arm, nails digging through fabric. Her father made a small sound that might have been a cough hastily converted from a laugh. Tristan, however, laughed outright, a genuine warm sound that lit up his entire face and made him look years younger. I meant it as a compliment, Lady Aurelia. Half the ladies in London spend hours constructing elaborate facades for visitors, creating perfect artifice. You apparently couldn't be bothered with such exhausting performance. He said it like it was admirable. Like her complete lack of preparation was somehow charming rather than mortifying. Like she hadn't just committed social suicide. Aurelia stared at him, trying desperately to understand what was happening. This wasn't how dukes behaved toward ordinary young ladies, especially not ordinary young ladies who looked like they'd been dragged backward through a thorn bush by vengeful horses. She started, then stopped, utterly unsure what to say. Won't you sit down, Aurelia? Her father interjected smoothly, gesturing toward the settee near the fireplace. His Grace and I were just concluding some business, but there's no reason we cannot enjoy tea whilst we finish. Oh God. Tea. That meant she'd have to remain for at least 30 minutes, looking like this, with Tristan Blackwood watching her with that inexplicable, unnerving expression of interest. Why was he looking at her like that? Join the crew. Hit subscribe and let's keep this mystery train rolling. Her mother finally released her arm, and Aurelia moved toward the indicated settee on legs that felt distinctly unstable, as though she were walking across the deck of a ship in a storm. She sat, arranging her hideous dress as best she could, which was to say, not well at all, hyper-aware of Tristan taking the chair directly across from her. Close enough that she could see the fine weave of his waistcoat. Close enough to smell the subtle scent of bergamot and something woodsy that made her thoughts scatter like startled birds. He was still watching her with that inexplicable expression. Why was he still watching her like that? A maid entered with the tea service, and Aurelia's mother began the ritual of pouring with practiced grace, her movements tight with barely suppressed mortification. The conversation resumed, her father and Tristan discussing something about agricultural improvements on the Duke's estates in Derbyshire, but Aurelia felt Tristan's gaze return to her repeatedly, like a physical touch against her skin. She tried to focus on her tea, tried to become invisible, tried to calculate the minimum amount of time before she could politely excuse herself and never show her face in civilized society again. Perhaps she could flee to Scotland. Or Italy. Somewhere far away where dukes didn't exist and women could dress like vagrants without consequence. Lady Aurelia, Tristan said suddenly, interrupting her father mid-sentence about crop rotation systems. The room fell silent. I find myself curious about your thoughts on a matter that's been troubling me lately. Aurelia looked up, teacup frozen halfway to her lips. Her thoughts? He wanted her thoughts? Men never wanted her thoughts. They wanted her silence, her pleasant smile, her decorative presence. Your Grace, she managed, her voice emerging steadier than she felt. Tristan leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes intense with what looked disturbingly like genuine interest. The reform movement. This push for extending tenant protections and limiting landlord rights to evict struggling farmers. I'm curious, do you believe such reforms would genuinely help the laboring classes, Or would they simply create economic inefficiency that ultimately harms everyone? The drawing room might as well have been struck by lightning. Aurelia's mother made a small, strangled sound. Her father's teacup clattered against his saucer. This wasn't drawing room conversation. This was dangerous, radical political discourse, the kind of topic that divided Parliament and sparked riots in the streets. And he was asking her opinion. Her. In her worst dress with her disastrous hair, looking like she'd crawled out from under a bridge. It felt like a trap. A test. Some elaborate joke where she'd give her honest opinion and he'd laugh at her presumption. But something in his expression, an openness, an intensity that suggested he actually wanted to hear her answer, made her forget her dress, forget her mortification, forget everything except the intellectual challenge he'd just thrown down like a gauntlet. "I believe," Aurelia said slowly, setting down her teacup with deliberate care, "that the question itself is flawed, Your Grace." Tristan's eyebrows rose. "Indeed? How so?" "You're framing it as though there are only two options, help the poor or create inefficiency. But that assumes our current system is somehow naturally efficient, which I would argue it most certainly is not." She felt her spine straightening, felt the familiar thrill of intellectual engagement overriding her embarrassment. When tenant farmers can be evicted on a landlord's whim after generations of working the same land, they have no incentive to improve the soil or invest in better cultivation methods. They're merely trying to survive until next quarter day. That's not efficiency, that's systematic instability masquerading as property rights. Her mother looked like she might faint. Her father had gone very still, watching her with an unreadable expression. But Tristan's face had transformed into something that looked dangerously close to delight. "So you believe property rights should be subordinate to social welfare?" "I believe property rights that create systemic suffering are philosophically indefensible," Aurelia countered, her earlier embarrassment evaporating like morning mist. This was what she'd been starving for. Real conversation. Real intellectual challenge. John Locke argued that property rights stem from mixing one's labor with the land. But when tenant farmers mix their labor with land for decades and can still be cast out with nothing, whose labor is actually being valued? The landlord who inherited the deed, or the farmer who makes the land productive? Locke also argued that property accumulation must leave enough and is good for others, Tristan said, and his voice had taken on an edge of excitement that matched her own. A principle our current system flagrantly violates. Precisely. Aurelia leaned forward, forgetting entirely that she was supposed to be demure and forgettable. And yet when reformers suggest even modest protections, requiring 6 months' notice before eviction, or compensation for improvements made to the land, they're accused of threatening the very foundations of civilization. Because the foundations of civilization, as they understand it, rest on the absolute sanctity of inherited privilege, Tristan said, his dark eyes never leaving her face. Any limitation on that privilege feels like revolution. Perhaps it is revolution, Aurelia said quietly. Perhaps that's exactly what's needed. The silence that followed was deafening. Aurelia realized, with a jolt of horror, that she just essentially advocated for social revolution. To a duke. A duke who owned vast estates and benefited enormously from the very system she was criticizing. What was wrong with her? Why couldn't she just smile and nod and discuss the weather like a normal person? But when she dared to look at Tristan, he wasn't recoiling in aristocratic horror. Instead, he was smiling, a slow, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. "You've read Thomas Paine," he said. It wasn't a question. Yes," Aurelia admitted, waiting for the inevitable condemnation. Paine was practically seditious reading for a young lady. Rights of Man or Common Sense? Both. And Mary Wollstonecraft's vindication of the rights of woman as well. Her mother actually whimpered. Her father had given up any pretense of drinking his tea and was simply staring at her as though she'd sprouted a second head. Tristan, however, looked like he'd just discovered buried treasure in his own drawing room. "Wollstonecraft's arguments about education," he said, his voice dropping lower, more intimate somehow despite the presence of her parents. Her claim that women appear inferior only because they've been systematically denied the education that would allow them to develop their rational faculties. Do you find her reasoning compelling? This was surreal. This couldn't be happening. Dukes didn't discuss Mary Wollstonecraft with unmarried ladies. They especially didn't discuss her with ladies wearing potato sack dresses and sporting hairstyles that suggested recent combat with wildlife. "I find it undeniable," Aurelia said, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Though I suspect most of London society would consider us both dangerously radical for admitting as much." "Most of London society," Tristan said, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made breathing difficult, "hasn't read anything more challenging than the society pages in 3 years. Their opinions on what constitutes dangerous radicalism are, I think, worth exactly as much as their opinions on philosophy, which is to say, nothing whatsoever." He said it with such casual certainty, such complete dismissal of society's judgment, that Aurelia felt something shift in her chest. Something that felt dangerously like hope. "Your Grace," her father said finally, his voice carrying a note of strained amusement, "I must confess I had no idea my daughter was quite so well-read in political philosophy." "Then you've been missing remarkable conversations, Lord Beaumont," Tristan said, still looking at Aurelia. "Lady Aurelia, I find myself wondering, would you be amenable to continuing this discussion at a later time? Perhaps tomorrow afternoon? I have several texts in my library I think you'd find fascinating, including a first edition of Wollstonecraft's Vindication that contains her handwritten marginalia." Aurelia's mind went completely blank. Had the Duke of Ashworth just invited her to his home? To see his library? To continue their conversation? "Aye," she started, then stopped, utterly incapable of forming coherent words. "That is," Tristan continued, and for the first time, she detected something that might have been nervousness in his voice, if such an invitation wouldn't be unwelcome. Unwelcome? He thought she might find it unwelcome? She'd have to be dead to find it unwelcome. "I would be honored, Your Grace," Aurelia managed, her voice barely above a whisper. The smile that spread across Tristan's face could have lit up the entire city of London. "Want to see more wild stories? Click subscribe and become part of the squad." The moment Tristan left, Aurelia fled to her bedchamber and locked the door. She stood in the center of the room, still wearing that wretched dress, and felt the full weight of what had just happened crash over her like a collapsing building. Her hands were shaking. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps that had nothing to do with her corset, which she wasn't even wearing because of the cursed potato sack gown. What had she done? What had she done? She'd essentially confessed to being a radical political revolutionary. To a duke. She discussed Mary Wollstonecraft and Thomas Paine like they were appropriate drawing room topics instead of the kind of reading material that could get one branded a dangerous subversive. And he'd invited her to his home. His library. Tomorrow. Aurelia sank onto her bed, pressing her palms against her eyes until she saw stars. It was a joke. It had to be a joke. Some elaborate, cruel entertainment for a bored aristocrat. He'd probably gone straight to his club to regale his friends with tales of the Marquis of Beaumont's peculiar daughter, who dressed like a vagrant and spouted revolutionary philosophy over tea. They were probably laughing about it right now, over brandy and cigars, imagining her showing up at his townhouse tomorrow like a pathetic fool who actually believed a duke could be interested in her ideas. The worst part, the absolutely devastating part, was that for those 20 minutes, she'd forgotten to be careful. She'd forgotten that her intelligence was supposed to be hidden, diminished, made palatable. She'd just been herself. Completely, recklessly herself. And he'd seemed fascinated. Which was precisely why it had to be mockery. Men like Tristan Blackwood didn't want women like her. They wanted ornamental creatures who enhanced their status, not argumentative bluestockings who questioned property rights and quoted seditious political philosophers. By morning, Aurelia had convinced herself he wouldn't come. He'd send a polite note citing unexpected business, and that would be the end of it. She'd be a cautionary tale, a footnote in drawing-room gossip. Remember Lady Aurelia Beaumont? Thought she could discuss politics with a duke. Poor deluded creature. She dressed carefully that morning, choosing a simple day dress in pale blue muslin. Appropriate, respectable, utterly forgettable. She let Bridget arrange her hair properly, pinned and coiled and civilized. She looked like every other young lady in London. Safe. Invisible. She told herself she was relieved. At precisely 2 o'clock, their butler appeared in the morning room where Aurelia was pretending to read. Lady Aurelia, His Grace the Duke of Ashworth has called for you. The book slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a thud that seemed to echo through her entire body. He'd come. He'd actually come. Aurelia's heart was hammering so violently she thought she might actually faint, which would be mortifying because she'd never fainted in her life and wasn't about to start now. She stood on legs that felt like they'd been replaced with something less substantial than air. "Show him to the drawing room, please," she managed. "I'll be there momentarily." She needed a moment. Just one moment to remember how to breathe like a normal human being. When she entered the drawing room, Tristan was standing by the window, backlit by afternoon sun that turned his dark hair almost bronze at the edges. He turned when he heard her, and something in his expression shifted, softened when he saw her. "Lady Aurelia," he said, and his voice carried that same warmth from yesterday, but underneath it, she detected something else. Something that sounded almost like nervousness? Impossible. Dukes didn't get nervous. "Your Grace," she said, executing a curtsy that was technically perfect because her mother had drilled it into her since she could walk. "I confess I'm surprised to see you." Surprised. He tilted his head slightly, studying her. "I told you I'd call." "Yes, well." Aurelia folded her hands in front of her, gripping her fingers together to keep them from trembling. "I assumed that was merely polite fiction. The sort of thing one says in company but doesn't actually mean." Something flickered across Tristan's face, something that looked almost like pain. "I see," he said quietly. "And why would you assume that?" "Because dukes don't call on women like me," Aurelia thought. "Because yesterday was too good to be true, and things that are too good to be true never are. Because I was wearing a potato sack yesterday and advocating for revolution," she said instead, aiming for light humor and landing somewhere closer to defensive bitterness. Not exactly the behavior that inspires follow-up visits. Tristan was quiet for a long moment, just looking at her with those impossibly dark eyes. Then he said, "May I sit?" "Of course." Aurelia gestured to the settee, and he sat, but instead of the casual sprawl most men adopted, he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his entire attention focused on her with an intensity that made her skin feel too tight. "Lady Aurelia," he said, and there was something raw in his voice that she'd never heard before. "May I speak frankly?" Her heart was going to pound straight through her ribcage. "Please." "I'm exhausted," Tristan said simply. Bone-deep, soul-destroying, exhausted in a way that has nothing to do with physical tiredness and everything to do with spending the last 6 years being hunted like particularly valuable game. Aurelia blinked, not understanding. Hunted. By every unmarried woman in England and their ambitious mothers. He ran a hand through his hair, disrupting its perfect style, making him look suddenly younger and far more human. "Do you know what it's like to have conversations where you can see the calculation in someone's eyes? Where every word, every smile, Every supposedly spontaneous laugh is choreographed to capture a title. I know, Aurelia admitted, because her problem had always been the opposite. I can't imagine. They wear their perfection like armor, Tristan continued, and there was something almost desperate in his voice now. Everything about them is crafted, designed, performed. Their hair is always immaculate. Their dresses cost fortunes. They say exactly what they think I want to hear, never a single genuine thought in their heads. And if I ask them what they think about anything of substance, they go blank and terrified because God forbid they say something that might displease a duke. He looked up at her, and the vulnerability in his eyes made her chest ache. And then yesterday, he said softly, you walked into your father's drawing room wearing the ugliest dress I've ever seen in my life. Despite everything, Aurelia felt a shocked laugh escape. Hardly a compliment, Your Grace. It was the most honest thing I'd seen in 6 years, Tristan said, and his voice had gone intense again, fervent. You weren't trying to impress me. You weren't trying to capture anything. You were just yourself. Brilliantly, defiantly, courageously yourself. I looked like I'd been dragged through a hedge backward, Aurelia protested weakly. You looked like someone who'd rather be comfortable than admired, Tristan countered. Like someone who had better things to think about than whether her dress impressed visiting dukes. And then you opened your mouth and proved it, arguing with me about property rights and social revolution like my opinion actually mattered to you beyond the fact that I have a title. Aurelia's mind was reeling. This couldn't be real. This conversation couldn't be happening. I don't understand, she whispered. You've watched me for 3 years. Across ballrooms, at balls and dinner parties. You always danced with other women. Perfect women. Tristan's expression transformed into something that looked like regret mixed with self-directed frustration. I was terrified, he said simply. Absolutely terrified. Of me. Of your mind, he clarified. Do you remember the Covington Ball? Our conversation about Rousseau. Of course I remember, Aurelia said, her voice barely audible. Every word of that conversation was burned into her memory like a brand. You challenged me, Tristan said. Actually challenged my interpretation of the social contract, argued your position brilliantly, made me reconsider ideas I'd held for years. And I thought, he stopped, laughed softly, bitterly. I thought, here is a woman who would see through every pretension I have. Here is a woman whose respect I'd actually have to earn, not simply receive by accident of birth. And I was absolutely convinced that someone with your intellect would take one real look at me and find me wanting. That's absurd, Aurelia said, the words escaping before she could stop them. You're brilliant. Our conversation yesterday proved that. Yesterday you gave me a chance, Tristan said quietly. For 3 years, I was too much of a coward to ask for one. I danced with safe women who wouldn't challenge me, who wouldn't make me risk actual rejection. And every time I saw you across a ballroom, looking at me with those extraordinary eyes, I told myself I was protecting myself from inevitable disappointment. He stood suddenly, crossing to stand directly in front of her chair, looking down at her with an expression that stole the breath from her lungs. That dress yesterday, he said, was the bravest thing I've seen in years. It said, I will not perform for you. I will not pretend to be something I'm not for your approval. And I found that more captivating than every perfectly choreographed ball entrance in Christendom. You truly mean this, Aurelia breathed, searching his face for any hint of deception and finding none. I truly mean this, Tristan confirmed. So I'll ask you plainly, Lady Aurelia, may I court you? Not the version of you in a perfect dress. You. The woman who reads Thomas Paine and argues about property rights and can't be bothered to impress visiting dukes because she has more important things to think about. If you're loving the suspense, you know what to do. Hit that subscribe and let's get into it. Aurelia opened her mouth to answer. Yes, God, yes, she wanted to scream. But Tristan held up one hand, stopping her. Before you answer, he said, would you walk with me? There's something I'd like to show you. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears, but she nodded. Tristan offered his arm, and the moment her hand touched his coat sleeve, she felt a jolt of electricity that had nothing to do with static and everything to do with the warmth of the solid muscle beneath the fabric. He led her through the drawing room doors, down the corridor, and out through the morning room into the private garden behind the townhouse. It was a small space, nothing compared to the vast country estates most aristocrats possessed, but it was beautiful in its intimacy. Rose bushes lined the brick walls, their blooms just beginning to open in the spring warmth. A small stone bench sat beneath an arbor thick with climbing jasmine. Tristan guided her to the bench, but he didn't sit. Instead, he paced a few steps away, then turned back to face her. The afternoon sun caught in his dark hair, and Aurelia thought distantly that she'd never seen him look more beautiful or more vulnerable. I need you to understand something, Tristan said, his voice low and intense. What I'm asking for, it won't be easy. Society will talk. They already whisper about me being too particular, too strange in my choices. If I court you, he stopped, seemed to gather himself. They'll say I'm making a mistake. That I should have chosen someone more conventional, more ornamental, more willing to simply smile and nod and be decorative. I know, Aurelia said quietly, feeling something cold settle in her stomach. Here it came. The reality. The reason this couldn't work after all. I don't want a duchess, Tristan continued, and his voice had turned fierce. I don't want someone who'll host perfect dinner parties and never contradict me and produce heirs whilst remaining a beautiful, empty cipher. I want a partner. Someone who'll argue with me when I'm wrong, challenge my thinking when I'm being stubborn, make me laugh when I'm taking myself too seriously. Someone who cares more about ideas than appearances, more about substance than status. He took a step closer, his dark eyes locked on hers. I want someone who'll wear a potato sack dress because she values her own comfort over my approval, he said, and there was something almost desperate in his voice now. Someone brave enough to be herself even when it costs her everything society says she should want. I want you, Aurelia. Not some polished version of you. You exactly as you are. Aurelia felt tears prick her eyes, hot and unexpected. No one had ever said anything like that to her. No one had ever suggested that her refusal to pretend, her stubborn authenticity, was anything other than a character flaw to be overcome. But what if, she started, her voice breaking. What if I'm not brave? What if yesterday was just desperation, not courage? What if I can't be that person all the time? Then you'll have days when you're scared and uncertain and wearing a perfectly acceptable dress, Tristan said, and impossibly he smiled. And I'll love you anyway. The word hung in the air between them like a living thing. Love. He'd said love. You don't, Aurelia whispered. You can't possibly mean it. Tristan crossed the remaining distance between them, stopping close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. I've spent 3 years watching you, Aurelia. 3 years of seeing you stand at the edges of ballrooms with that look on your face like you were mentally cataloging everything absurd about the social rituals happening around you. 3 years of overhearing snippets of your conversations and thinking, there. That's what intelligence sounds like. That's what genuine thought looks like. 3 years of being too much of a coward to approach you because I was convinced someone like you would see through someone like me and find nothing worth keeping. That's insane, Aurelia said, her voice fierce despite the tears now streaming down her cheeks. You're brilliant and kind and the only man in 6 years who's ever asked my opinion about anything that mattered. The only man who's ever looked at me like I was a person instead of a problem to be solved or a decoration to be acquired. Then why are you crying? Tristan asked gently, and he reached up to brush away a tear with his thumb, the gesture so tender it made her chest ache. Because this is exactly what I wanted, Aurelia confessed, the words tumbling out like water breaking through a dam. Exactly what I've dreamed about since that first conversation at the Covington ball. I've spent 3 years loving you from a distance, convinced you'd never see me, never want me, never look past all the beautiful perfect women who surrounded you. And now you're here, saying everything I wanted to hear, and I'm terrified that if I reach for it, it'll evaporate like morning mist. Tristan's expression transformed into something that looked like wonder mixed with regret. You loved me, he breathed. For 3 years, you loved me. Hopelessly, Aurelia admitted, and she was crying in earnest now, tears and laughter mixing together in a way that should have been mortifying but somehow wasn't. Stupidly. Desperately. I tried so hard to stop, to be sensible, to accept that dukes don't notice women like me. But every time I saw you, every time you smiled at something someone said or got that intense look when you were thinking deeply about something, I fell a little bit more. We're idiots, Tristan said, and suddenly he was laughing too, his eyes bright with emotion. We're both complete idiots. We could have had 3 years, Aurelia. 3 years of conversations and debates and learning each other, and instead we wasted them being afraid. I'm still afraid, Aurelia whispered. I'm terrified this isn't real, that I'll wake up and it'll all have been some elaborate dream. Tristan reached for her hands, enfolding them in his larger, warmer ones. Then let me prove it's real, he said. Let me court you properly. Let me call on you and take you driving in the park and escort you to balls where we'll horrify the ton by actually conversing about interesting topics instead of dancing 17 times without speaking a word. Let me show you, every single day, that this is real and solid and not going anywhere. Aurelia looked up at him, at this impossible man who'd somehow seen past every wall she'd built, every defense she'd erected, straight through to the terrified, hopeful, desperately in love woman beneath. She thought about spending the rest of her life pretending to be less than she was, or worse, spending it alone because she refused to pretend. And then she thought about the alternative, spending it with someone who valued her mind as much as her heart, who wanted her arguments as much as her affection, who found her potato sack dress rebellion beautiful instead of mortifying. Yes, she said, and the word came out stronger than she expected, clear and certain. Yes, Your Grace. I would be honored to accept your courtship. The smile that broke across Tristan's face was incandescent. Tristan, he said. When we're alone, please call me Tristan. Tristan, Aurelia repeated, testing the feel of his name on her tongue without any formal address, and it felt like freedom. He raised her hands to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, his eyes never leaving hers. I should speak to your father, he said. Immediately. I'm not giving you a single moment to reconsider or doubt or talk yourself out of this. Aurelia laughed, the sound bright and genuine and completely unguarded. I thought dukes were supposed to be dignified and measured. I'm terrified you'll realize you could do infinitely better, Tristan admitted with ruthless honesty. So I'm claiming you before you come to your senses. He kept hold of her hand as they walked back into the house, as though afraid she might disappear if he let go. They found her father in his study, bent over correspondence, and when he looked up to see Aurelia and the Duke standing in his doorway, hand in hand, his eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. Lord Beaumont, Tristan said, his voice formal but carrying an undercurrent of barely suppressed joy, I'd like to request permission to formally court your daughter, with the intention of marriage should she continue to find me acceptable. Aurelia's father looked at her, really looked at her, and whatever he saw in her face made him smile. Well, he said dryly, I suppose that explains yesterday's unprecedented discussion of revolutionary political theory in my drawing room. Tell me, Your Grace, should I expect regular debates about the dismantling of aristocratic privilege at future family gatherings? Almost certainly, Tristan said without hesitation. "Your daughter has very strong opinions about property rights, and I have no intention of asking her to moderate them." Lord Beaumont laughed outright. "Then you have my blessing, Your Grace, and my congratulations on being brave enough to choose a woman with a mind of her own. Most men aren't." "Most men," Tristan said, squeezing Aurelia's hand gently, "are fools. Don't be a stranger. Subscribe now and let's dive deeper into the unknown." Their first appearance together at the Pemberton Ball created exactly the scandal Tristan had predicted. Aurelia heard the whispers, saw the raised eyebrows, watched the beautiful Lady Rosalind Pembroke's face crumple with disappointment. When Lady Cavendish loudly questioned whether the Duke had taken leave of his senses, Aurelia simply smiled and said, "One might argue that falling in love with someone's mind rather than their dress budget is the first sensible thing any Duke has done in a generation." Tristan had laughed outright, kissed her gloved hand in full view of the entire ballroom, and asked her to dance. 2 years later, Aurelia stood in the library of their Derbyshire estate, watching Tristan read philosophy to their 6-month-old daughter, who was far too young to understand but seemed fascinated by her father's voice nonetheless. They'd left London almost entirely, hosting salons for writers and reformers instead of vapid society dinners. Aurelia had published an essay on education reform under a pseudonym. Tristan had sponsored legislation for tenant protections. "What are you thinking about?" Tristan asked, looking up to find her watching him. Aurelia smiled, remembering a hideous brownish dress and a desperate act of rebellion that had accidentally been the bravest thing she'd ever done. "I'm thinking," she said softly, "that the worst dress in Christendom was actually the best decision I ever made." Tristan's answering smile held 3 years of shared understanding, countless debates, and a love built not on pretense but on the radical act of being genuinely, completely known. "Come here," he said, shifting their daughter to one arm and extending the other toward Aurelia. She crossed the room and folded herself into his embrace, breathing in bergamot and books and home. Outside, rain began to fall on the rose garden. Inside, surrounded by thousands of books and the 2 people she loved most in the world, Aurelia Blackwood, Duchess of Ashworth, had never been more perfectly, authentically happy. Want to see more wild stories? Click subscribe and become part of the squad.